Eternity. There has been a tendency to operate with a dualism between the concrete time of our experience and eternity. That is, to assume that time and eternity are two entirely different things that can have nothing in common with each other. In Christ we see that the eternal is able to invade time, and that as different as time and eternity may be, they can and do indeed overlap. The eternity of time, which for our purposes is primarily the pre-existence of God over the everlastingness of God, though this is also important, but is a less difficult concept, seems at first glance to be something that is not dependent on the Father-Son relationship to help us understand. After all, does not the very opening passage of Genesis say, "In the beginning God," implying that God is pre-existent and thus eternal? And yet, though this seems logical, it is more complicated than this. For example, according to Greco-Roman philosophy, God was eternal, but so was creation, meaning that God does not predate the created order. To say that God is eternal would have been granted, but it would have been argued that this is nothing unique, for all matter is equally eternal. God's eternality is a given, but it doesn't tell us anything. It might be argued that the key texts that speak of God as being eternal and especially pre-existent are Old Testament texts, again such as Genesis 1:1, and thus the eternity of God is just as much a Jewish conviction as a Christian one. It is therefore not dependent on the incarnation of the Son of God for clarity. What is interesting is that though Christians do indeed refer to the Old Testament text to support their view of the eternity of God, the Jewish community did not come to widespread doctrinal agreement on the doctrine of creation out of nothing, in Latin creatio ex nihilo, which is a strongly related conviction to the unique eternity of God, until the late Middle Ages. This has to do with the fact that the idea of creation in the Old Testament often carries with it a sense of ordering, more than creation in its most narrow sense. However, though there were doubts within the Jewish community, Christians were convinced that God created the universe out of nothing from the very beginning, and this was the case because of the incarnation. In the New Testament, Christ is continually referred to as the one through whom God created everything. John 1:3, Colossians 1:16 and 17, Hebrews 1:2, just to give a few examples. This links the doctrines of creation and incarnation together in a deep way and intensifies both of them. It places the Son of God on the Creator side of the Creator-creation relationship, to be discussed further below, and emphasizes the pre-existence of God, both the Father and the Son. This is not to say that it is utterly impossible to arrive at a doctrine of the pre-existence or eternity of God without a doctrine of the incarnation, as the Jewish people have indeed done so, but it was indeed a historical impetus that pressed this belief on the mind of the early church and pushed them to place a high importance on such a connection. There are many other topics that could be discussed under the heading of the attributes of God, but we will stop here for a few reasons. First, because the primary point of this section is to emphasize the methodological concern for understanding God in and through the incarnate Son, rather than independently of the concrete revelation in God, which tends to lean more on secular philosophy than the actual revelation of God. Another reason to hold back from engaging with every conceivable attitude is because this form of doing theology as a whole seems to be based more on what is God like as an abstract question rather than how has God revealed himself to us. This does not mean that we cannot learn about God's omniscience, omnipresence, and other attributes from the incarnation, but that these ideas are far less central to the Christian faith, though not to be totally ignored, and are less burdened by philosophical baggage. The baggage that is associated with God's omniscience overlaps considerably with that associated with God's omnipotence. In light of these considerations, we will move on to another important observation that bears upon our contemporary situation.